On the second panel, we're going to discuss global value chain resilience in the face of geoeconomics shocks. And we welcome the two panelists. One is Professor Baldwin, and the second panelist is Professor Yasuyuki TODO. And Richard, it's your turn again, so we're going to listen to you.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen here. So my talk is about GVC resilience are coming from a CEPR discussion paper I published this year with Rebecca Friedman, who's an economist at the Bank of England, called Global Risk and Global Supply Chains, What We Know and What We Need to Know. And what I'm going to do in my comments is provide some background points or understandings about how to think about global supply chain resilience in the face of all sorts of shocks, because Rebecca and I found that there was a great deal of misthinking about global supply chains and the nature of shocks. So I'm going to talk about a little background things before I get more specific. So first, about global supply chains. The most important thing to remember is not one size fits all. Many analysts have in mind something like the auto industry when they think about global supply chains, but it's important to realize that there are at least two very important differences. There's simple versus complex global supply chains. So the simple supply chain is sourcing simple inputs from abroad. So for example, Germany's dependence on Russia is a simple global supply chain. There's sourcing one thing that doesn't go back and forth, and that creates certain dependencies and certain risks, but they're very different from the second type, the complex global supply chains. Here it's companies sourcing sophisticated inputs from abroad, say computer chips or a particular type of engine or a particular battery, or back and forth processing like we see across the US-Mexican border or between Germany and Poland, for example. Now, risk and reactions in complex global supply chains are entirely different than in simple. So keep those distinctions in mind when we think about geoeconomic risks to the global supply chains. My second big point is that global supply chains, the risks, they're not all the same. It's not one size fits all when it comes to the risk. On the left side, I'm going to talk about the sources of the risk, the supply shocks, demand shocks, and transportation shocks, just to put three very big categories. And on the right side, I'm going to talk about the types, idiosyncratic versus systemic. Let me start with the sources. So when global supply chains are subject to shocks, it's very important to remember whether the shock is coming from supply or demand. And all of us during the pandemic have seen all of these, all three of them. So for example, in the early phase, when China shut down some of the regions which were producing many of the manufacturing goods, it was very clearly a supply shock. So I had the three types of supply shocks, and I was going to come on to the demand shocks. So a big part of the problem that's going on in the United States is during lockdown, people couldn't spend money on services like restaurants and movies, so they started buying goods instead. And since they couldn't go to the shop, they started buying online. And that shift of demand from services to goods and from retail outlets to online was a shock that disrupted the normal way, and it led to all sorts of problems that had nothing to do with supply. And then, of course, there's transportation shocks. So, for example, Singapore, which is a hub for sea transport between the East and the West for many, many things, they refused to have crew changes through Singapore in order to control COVID. And that meant that a lot of ships got stuck in Singapore. So that was a disruption of supply shock. Now, if we go over to types of shocks, idiosyncratic shocks, these are things like earthquakes or strikes, things like that. And I'd like to point out that the companies involved in these global supply chains know all about idiosyncratic shocks. there's an entire literature on logistics and management of supply chain management in which they know there will be shocks, idiosyncratic shocks, and they optimize their businesses in order to deal with them. There's not much to do about that, and I don't think we need much intervention. But what's really different about what we're seeing now is that we're seeing some systemic shocks. And what I mean by systemic is that it affects many sectors and many countries at the same time. Of course, COVID-19 was the most classic one of these, but the very spectacular one we have seen. But climate change, arguably, will be a systemic shock because, for example, extreme weather events may affect all the industries in many countries in a particular region, and changing heat and changing migration patterns may also lead to systemic shocks. And lastly, and most prominently in the news, US-China geoeconomic shocks, and more recently, Russia, NATO kind of geostrategic shocks can lead to disruption of industries, across countries, and for a sustained period of time. The classic example here is the tariffs that Trump put on China, and then a whole bunch of other countries, and the tariffs that were put on in retaliation. Those were systemic shocks, which weren't really in the thinking of companies. Okay, if I can come to the next one. So now, two recovery concepts that are important when you think about the risks. The first is robustness. The second is resiliency. And these are jargon terms in the literature. So robustness means ability to continue during the shock. And that's relatively easy to do when you have simple global value chains, but it's very hard to do when you have complex global supply chains because of the long-term relationship that's necessary between the buyer and the seller. So for complex value chains, businesses usually go to resilience, which means that they can recover quickly after the shock. So the classic is what happened with the great tsunami and earthquake in eastern Japan a few years ago. The companies had to shut down because their supplies were disrupted. But because they had long-term relationships with the suppliers, they could go off contract and very rapidly restore the production. And that required a different kind of thing than keeping it going. Okay, so our policy is needed. And I just want to make 3 points here. First of all, you should match policy to shocks. There is no one-size-all policy. So for instance, if you have demand shocks, it's no good diversifying your supply. If it's a demand shock, the only thing that works is stockpiling or excess capacity. If you have idiosyncratic supply shocks, geodiversification may help as long as it's not a systemic shock. So it's no use having China +1 if it affects the entire East Asia, for example. And if it's international transportation shocks, then reshoring may help, but reassuring may expose you to other things. And lastly, systemic shocks, geoeconomic shocks, which is kind of the part of the question of today. There you need allies, you may potentially need nearshoring, and above all, you should identify some strategic sectors, and I'll talk about that in a second. Number two is there are some no regrets policy. So supplier information is a public good. And this is something that actually Japan has known about since the 70s, when you set up what's called the Asian input-output matrix at JETRO and collected information on where Japanese companies were sourcing. This goes way back into the 70s. But more modernly, we should have stress tests on critical supply chains. In other words, the government should do like the regulatory authorities in finance, they say, what would happen if there was a 2-year recession of this amount in this country? What would happen to your portfolio? And we should be doing that with critical supply chains. The government should be doing this. Now, the point is that these global supply chains now are so complicated that not even the most sophisticated companies know where everything comes from that they're buying. So it's really kind of a systemic thing that needs to be looked at. Moreover, that knowledge is a public good. So the companies don't have the proper reward to gathering that information. And then macro circuit breakers. It's important to say, especially in the COVID shock, the macro stabilization dampened the snowball effect that can come with disruptions and bankruptcies, and therefore did it. The last point I want to make is with respect to China. So there's been some talk about China backing Russia, therefore the US extending sanctions to China and having a big problem, not just shutting off Russian gas, but shutting off much more from China. And I'd like to point out that unscrambling this omelet will be hard. You know, an omelet you make by breaking the eggs and scrambling it up and cooking it. And what we're going to be trying to do is take the omelet apart and put it back into the egg, and that will be very, very difficult. So here's some work I've done with Rebecca on foreign input reliance. So this is a heat map, and the column nation's inputs into the row nation's domestic production. And the message is China is like the OPEC of industrial inputs worldwide. So it will be very difficult in the short run to take it out. So let me show you, this is for 2018, which is the latest available year in terms of the data. And these are the suppliers, the column countries are the suppliers. And you see that only the US and China are major suppliers to all the major producers in the world. So Germany is inside Europe and Japan is inside East Asia, but China and the US are major suppliers all across the world. And this is the percentage of gross inputs sourced, for instance, by the US from China is 3%. For Mexico, it's 9%. For Korea, it's 12%. Those are very large numbers. So they're gross numbers, of course. So trying to shut off China from all these manufacturers, major manufacturers in the world, will be extremely expensive and difficult and probably won't happen very fast. So that's just, I think, a perspective of people who throw around, oh, the world's gonna fragment into 2 blocks and we're gonna go back to the GATT and the Comecon. That is not the same thing because the supply chains are already so integrated and China is already so dominant in the supply of industrial inputs. And I stress, these aren't final goods, these are inputs into production. So with that, I will just close and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the insightful presentation. Now, next, we listen to Professor TODO for his perspective.
So let me start. First of all, I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to this great symposium. So today I'd like to talk about industrial policies for resilient and innovative supply chains. So let me start with a conceptual conclusion based on my empirical studies, which is geographically diversified supply chains are more resilient. So these figures are showing that firms are more resilient in the pandemic, in the COVID-19 pandemic, if they have supply chain partners in different countries. And this is because substitution of disrupted partners is easier when supply chains are more diversified. In other words, domestic concentration of partners is risky considering possible domestic shocks. Now, this is another evidence to support this claim from the Hurricane Sandy in the US. And also, geographically diversified supply chains are innovative because firms can learn new knowledge from distant partners more than domestic partners. These figures are from Japanese firms showing that firms are more productive when they are linked with distant partners. And in addition to supply chains, global knowledge networks of firms are getting more and more important, as shown in this figure. And I found that international research collaboration can raise the quality of innovation of firms measured by the number of patent citations substantially, and the effect of international collaboration is higher than the effect of domestic collaboration, possibly because firms can learn more from foreign partners than domestic partners. So this is a basic conceptual framework. And now let's see current policies of Japan, the US, and European countries to reorganize global supply chains by decoupling themselves from China. So the governments of these countries impose restrictions on imports, technology transfer, and foreign direct investment inflows in high-tech sectors because of national security concerns. More recently, they target the resilience of supply chains, particularly those in the semiconductor industry, by reshoring of plants to the domestic economy using huge amount of subsidies, and by supporting R&D in high-tech sectors. Currently, in Japan, the economic security bill has been discussed in the House of Representatives to strengthen the security in economic transactions. What are the effects of these policies? So this figure shows the level of concentration of partner countries in intermediate good imports. A higher level means a lower diversification, and a lower level means a higher diversification. So you can see that in some countries like South Korea and Australia, the level of concentration has been increasing, and it is relatively low for European countries. And if you look at China, it's actually decreasing. That means China has been successfully diversified their its supply chain partners. And this, Japan and the US recently decreased the level of concentration, possibly because of decoupling policies. And changes in the concentration level corresponds to the share of China in intermediate good imports. So the share of China has been increasing in South Korea and Australia and decreasing in Japan and the US. So let me summarize, overall trade between the US and China is actually increasing, particularly after the wake of COVID-19 in 2020. And if you look at the exports of high-tech products from the US to China, actually our exports of electrical machinery is increasing, while exports of precision machinery are stable. But the exports of aircrafts are actually decreasing. And this figure looks at the exports of more disaggregated products from the US to China, related to semiconductors. And mostly they are either increasing or stable. Only this guy is declining. So these figures clearly show that exports of high-tech products from the US to China are not decreasing, but exports of only limited products are decreasing. Maybe products that are very sensitive to national security, like aircrafts. And if you look at Japan, similar. High-tech exports from Japan to China are not declining. Electrical machinery is increasing. Precision machinery, automobiles are stable. So let me summarize these figures. First, supply chain diversity is too low for some Asia-Pacific countries such as South Korea, Australia, and Japan because of their heavy reliance on China. Second, recent policies of Japan and the US are successful in increasing supply chain diversity while not decreasing overall trade with China. Finally, however, there's still a room for Japan to decrease its reliance on China in supply chains, particularly considering the recent situation in Ukraine and Russia. So based on the conceptual framework and evidence, I'd like to provide some policy suggestions. First, policies should not focus too much on reshoring, but should focus more on diversification of supply chains, because self-sufficiency is inefficient and vulnerable. But supply chains should be diversified among countries without national security concerns. So Japan should reduce reliance on China, but it should be also emphasized that Japan should not be decoupled from China completely because of economic benefits. However, Japan and the US have successfully done so so far, so this trend should be continued further. And for this purpose, we should utilize international frameworks such as G7, Quad, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and Japan-US, Japan-EU FTAs to lower surge costs of business matching and national security risks. Second, in addition to supply chains, we should expand the international knowledge networks among countries without national security concerns, because innovation is the key to economic growth, economic resilience, and national security. Actually, closed innovation may be secure, but is quite inefficient. However, it should also be emphasized that we need to protect the high technology, and for this purpose, maybe we can utilize international frameworks such as G7, Quad, FOIP, and FTAs again. But in these policies, we should also it should be also emphasized that restrictions are needed, but should be minimal, as Professor Yano emphasized at the beginning of this symposium. And also clear rules should be presented to the private sector beforehand, so that they can actually optimize their benefits, their profits. Finally, policies should not focus too much on the semiconductor industry, but should cover broad industries and firms, because any product can be a choke point in supply chains. And industrial policy targeting limited industries has not been necessarily successful, even in China, according to many authors. Also, to be effective, industrial policies should be combined with competitive policies so that competition among firms and among industries are promoted. So 10 minutes is not enough to explain everything, but so I would expect many questions after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Todo, for the wonderful presentation. And we have 5 minutes left. And but first, I'd like to ask Richard on the basic question. Today's overall theme is a new capitalism, and we're going to discuss systemic supply chain shocks, especially geopolitical supply chain shock rising from the geopolitical shocks. What is the implication and the relevance of supply chain discussion in the overall theme of the new capitalism?
So I think let me answer that in sort of two levels. So one is the idea that we have to go to a more circular, sustainable, inclusive, resilient kind of society. I think that's what the new capitalism is. And in that list, resilience is really what Professor Todo and I were talking about. And I think the world we used to live in, or at least we thought we were living in, where basically everybody had some differences, but we were all sort of on the same side and going towards the same destinations. That has turned out to be a lot more fragile than we thought it was. And there are major disruptions that may very well happen, and we sort of have to get rid of it, get ready for it. And so the new capitalism is in some sense going back to a much older world where blocks matter, geostrategic things interact with economics much more robustly and quickly. And I think that's how I would say that these things are related. It's a matter of resilience, and the fact in the new capitalism is not just resilience and sustainability when it comes to climate change and gender issues and intergenerational issues and income inequality. It's also about stability and reliability of international partners and learning and taking on a board that we're in a different world now than we thought just 5 years ago, really just 5 years ago, maybe even just 3 years ago. We sort of thought we were in a different world. So that's how I would answer it at the very, very high level. I also think that, which neither Yas nor I talked about, is the interaction between climate change and global supply chains. And I think that's is another dimension where the new capitalism affects with the global supply chains, that the green considerations need to be taken into account. And if we get carbon border taxes, as is almost surely going to happen in Europe and may therefore spread other places, the idea of the carbon content of your global supply chain will start to matter a lot. So those two things will start to interact. The sustainability of new capitalism and the global supply chain will matter because of carbon pricing. Well, I don't know if I answered the question, but it was a tricky one.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, but you mentioned that geopolitics and blocks matters, but you and Professor Todo also mentioned that interdependence, where we are living economically and politically. So what is the balance or what is the role of a rule-based system to bridge the gap between the geopolitics and the interdependence of the world economy?
Right. Thank you. So I read just today in the Financial Times, somebody was saying economic interdependence helps maintain the peace until it doesn't. That's kind of the problem. Is there is a quite substantial empirical literature that shows trade relationships and investment relationships reduce the likelihood of conflicts between countries for all sorts of reasons you could imagine. But those kinds of golden handcuffs mean that if the fighting does start, it's very, very difficult to undo it. So it's kind of on purpose that you depend upon China, and their dependence upon the West and the West dependence on them is one of the things that prevents some of the conflicts. So on the whole, I think it's been useful and reduced conflicts to have interdependence. But when it comes to rogue states, when countries really start acting in a way that's completely unacceptable from the international perspective, not just from the 21st century perspective, but even back to the 19th century, doing things like that, it's a different world. And so we might have to think harder about who are reliable trading partners and not come up with some idea that we need to have more decoupling or less decoupling, but more intelligent interdependence, and realize that there are some countries in this world who can or may engage in very disruptive things that will have big consequences for commercial realities. And that's the world we live in now. And maybe we always did, but we were hoping that it wasn't doing that. But I think at least since COVID, it's become very clear that the world is different, and we have to react to that. So I think I said that as politely as I could, but.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very insightful. Professor Todo, you have any comment on that one?
Sorry. Basically, I agree with Richard, but I actually think the world has changed drastically since COVID or Ukraine, because we have long known that diversification can lower risks. So this basic rules still can apply to anything. And also, so from this perspective, actually, Asian countries increase reliance on China too much, as I show in the figure. So we should lower the heavy reliance. And as I emphasized earlier, Japan and the US showed that it is possible. So we can do that. We can, go back to the the old state in terms of the reliance on China. And as Richard emphasized, inter-reliance is interdependencies can avoid the conflicts, but reliance too much cannot avoid conflict. Also, another issue is interdependence in terms of technologies is also important to avoid conflicts. If China rely on the Western technologies very much, then they have a good reason not to have a conflict with the West. So the technology issues are also very important, I guess.
Thank you very much, Professor Todo. We have many questions from the audience, but we already passed our scheduled time. So with this, I'd like to close our second session, and then I pass over to Richard again to wrap up today's seminar, including session 1 and session 2.